episode of Mind the Gap, making education work across the globe with me, Emma Turner, and my co-host, Jon Hutchinson. Hello, Jon.
Hello. I'm, people who are listening to this won't know, but if you're watching, you'll see I'm sat in a chair today. And usually I do it cross-legged, sat on the floor, like a good primary school teacher. And so we can test to see whether it makes any difference, me being a chair to my...
Sensible head on today, Jon.
Yeah, I'm feeling status.
I'm hoping that you've got the chair because we need a little bit of gravitas and a little bit of reverence for our fantastic guest this morning, who I've been absolutely itching to get on for ages, the absolutely fabulous Liz Pemberton. Good morning, Liz, and welcome.
Hello, Emma. Hello, Jon. Thank you so much. What a beautiful introduction. And it's nice to be that I have... nice to hear that I've been highly anticipated and you've wanted to get me on. I've really wanted to have this conversation. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be here this morning.
Oh, an absolute joy to have you on, Liz. And I've been an avid follower of your work for some time now. But for those listeners who haven't yet stumbled across your work or got in touch or had the pleasure of listening to you speak about your areas of expertise, just give us an overview of your career to date and what you're currently working on at the moment.
Sure. So primarily I started in early years as a nursery manager back in the early 2000s, probably around 2004. But my mom, who is somebody who's worked in the sector since the mid 80s, late 80s, bought her first nursery in Birmingham in an area called Smethwick, around, as I said, like probably 1986, 87. So with that in mind, the early years has always been a part of my life as a mother who owned a day nursery and also managed that nursery as well. And she went on to own and manage 3 children's day nurseries as part of a chain. And I got involved in the business really initially to think about, I guess, primarily, what does it mean to create an environment where children can thrive, children under 5 can thrive? That had always been something that my mom was very invested in as somebody who had 3 children by 1990, and also was very concerned with the quality of provision that was there, moving from a childminding model to an early years space, a nursery. She had us in a range of different kinds of settings and thought, I want to have a go at this. I want to have a go at creating something. And of course, the nursery model in the 80s and 90s looked a bit different to how it is now. And so when I officially joined the business in 2004, I managed the second nursery that she bought in 1994 and came in as somebody who was looking at staff training coordinator. That was my official role, the role that I had created, but a role I still had to apply for. Because initially, when I thought about joining the family business, it was because I wanted to do something that engaged with community, engaged with motivation around early years educators. And I thought about the environment very carefully because I knew that was the thing that was really impacting the children. And very quickly, I became really invested in what it looked like to manage a setting like this, and also the succession of family business within the early years space, and also being very mindful about the time that my mom bought the business, or in the area that she'd bought the business, you know, race and racism and community and a political landscape which really kind of heightened people's awareness of what it meant to be a Black woman owning a business in that time, in that space, what it meant, and some of the kind of adverse reactions and responses to that. I mean me and my sisters, we bared witness to that, and also the impact that that had on my mom, in that it didn't deter her. And that was really interesting for me growing up, seeing that firsthand. So by the time it came for me to get into a space of managing in Birmingham, in Edgbaston, I thought about creating a nursery where not only would children and families come in and obviously want to thrive and feel like it was a home from home setting, but also a setting which acknowledged the importance of culture, the importance of a sense of belonging, and also the importance of honouring some of those cultural practices around Black African and Black African Caribbean families. So we colloquially became known as the Black Nursery. You know, it's not Edgbaston Park Day Nursery. It's the Black Nursery down the road. And it was, you know, said in a way which really affirmed some of those things, those principles that I held highly. It was important for me to create that. And it also became very important for the children and the families that were accessing the space. But having said that, it isn't, or it wasn't the fact that it was something that we had thought about and we were only providing care, of course, for Black children. It was a space where, of course, children who were racialized as white, children who were South Asian, children whose heritage was rooted in East or Southeast Asia, newly arrived families from all over the world. So we were, yes, a multicultural setting, but primarily the majority of the children and families that happened to come were Black African and Black African Caribbean. And the team of educators that I had kind of really developed came from all around the world. So it really was an international team with a primarily Black African and Black African Caribbean children and families who were registering and who were starting. And at any one time, which I found really interesting, there would be 1 or 2 white British children who would be in the nursery and who would start. And I would really kind of observe that, because I wondered what it was about the setting which drew them to it, when we often know there is perhaps a landscape where there were lots of different nurseries that people could choose to send their children. And often people go where they feel like people are the same as them, whatever that means and whatever way in which they are defining same. But we tended to find that Black children would start the nursery, and white families, when they came to look around, they would and ah sometimes. Sometimes they'd say, you know, it's not the right fit. It wasn't what we were looking for. And I thought about what that could mean in terms of, was it to do with an Ofsted judgment? Was it to do with the way in which the nursery was laid out? Was it to do with the team? So I had all of these thoughts in my mind as I was developing and progressing in my professional career. And then COVID hit, fast forward, COVID hit in 2020. And I thought about the pedagogy. I thought about some of the things that we had instilled in our setting. I thought about some of the conversations I'd had with many families that we were providing care for their children for over the years. And I thought about what made our nursery unique in the space that we were occupying. And knowing that we were colloquially known as the Black Nursery, I thought about how I could present some of the ideas that we had had in our nursery to a wider audience, i.e. the wider early years sector, and what those ideas were rooted in: cultural safety, psychological safety, really acknowledging that racism is trauma, and actually the impact of that on children and families who are Black, who are from the global majority, is lifelong. And some of the things that we would do in terms of our practice to counter those things were really successful, and children were impacted positively, and families spoke about it for a long time after their children had left. And so when COVID came, I thought really about what I could do. And of course, we know the landscape at the time and the messaging we were getting politically around nurseries being open and staying open, it was a bit confusing. And particularly when you have, and you know that the staff team is primarily, you know, a mixture of people from all around the world. But for those Black and brown staff, who we knew at the time, the statistics were telling us, people who were on the front line, people that were working in services where they were engaging directly with people who had had COVID, and some of those statistics around Black and brown people being the first to die or be seriously impacted by their health, that had consequences for my team. And so it really kind of added to the decision, along with other things, as to why I wanted to close the nursery, not reopen. I'd had a good 17-year stretch doing what I was doing, and I thought about training and development. And so in 2020, I decided that I wanted to set up an anti-racist training and consultancy company, called it the Black Nursery Manager. It does what it says on the tin. And I thought I wanted to create not only a name that would stick in the minds of people, but also a name that was quite confronting, because using the word Black, it says something, and it says something very specifically about what it is that I'm doing, or what it is that it could mean. And I wanted to get people talking about it initially. And so when I started the business, I was like, right, I can go out to a few nurseries within the area, within the locality, and perhaps within the city, and just talk a little bit about my journey and a little bit about what we did with the children and families. And then it snowballed. And I know there were a lot of other things and factors you know, not to dismiss at all, of course, the Black Square Summer of 2020, which is what I call it, this racial awakening for some. But for many others, this was nothing new. So, of course, I'm talking about the murder of George Floyd in the United States, but also what it meant for other people, Black men specifically in the UK, who are at the hands of police brutality. Of course, we record this today knowing about the case yesterday, verdict released around Chris Kaba. And so I think when we're talking about Black men, we're talking about police brutality and violence, we have to remember that those Black men started off as children within a system that has to be prepared to really face the realities of some of their lived experiences. And so when I started doing the work, as I said, I thought, yeah, something local, something for the city. And as I said, it snowballed, and it meant that I was being pulled here, there, and everywhere. And I was really thankful for that. It was great because it actually showed there was a niche. There was something that the early years sector wanted to speak about, and there was something that the early years sector wanted to improve in terms of its practice, an area that was a weakness. And I was the person that was called to fill in the gaps, but I always made sure to let people know nothing that I was doing was brand new. Nothing that I was saying was new or radical. The work of anti-racism and the work of anti-racist practice had always and has always been done, not just in the city that I'm from, but throughout the UK and beyond. So that's as short as I could get it, Emma and John.
I just listening to that, it's so obvious, like you say, that there is a need for the conversations to be had. And there's a phrase that I've pulled from some of your work where it says everybody working with small children must recognize the significant impact they have on their worldview. And I think that was the thing that jumped out for me, that we are working with children right at their very beginning of their lives, when they're beginning to form their perceptions and their understanding of how the world works. So I just wondered if you can kind of unpack that, what that might look like in terms of the work that people are doing with our youngest children who are just starting to form their perceptions of the world.
I think a lot of this is about reflecting on yourself as an educator, first of all. What's been your life experience, firstly, particularly pertaining to race and racism? And who is it and how do you identify? Who is it that you identify with? How do you identify in terms of your racialized identity, in terms of your culture, in terms of your ethnicity? And how important has that been to you at different points in your life, and why? So when I think about in terms of influencing and impacting children's worldviews, I always ask educators to think about themselves first, because who are you and how are you going to bring that influence to the children, particularly if you perhaps have never thought about your racialized identity or never thought about how that's impacted how you have navigated through the world and through, you know, your own communities or other communities. And then thinking about what it means to reinforce some of these ideas positively or negatively with the children that you're working with, and your wider understanding about how and why society is structured the way that it is when it pertains to race and racism. So thinking about my own experience or my setting as a nursery manager, when I talked about having majority Black children in the space, does that mean that there is one homogenous way of looking at all Black children? Well, of course not, because people are individuals. But it is to say that there is something that we have to regard in terms of culture, finding out about the diversity of cultures and the diversity of people, although they may be under this one umbrella term of being racialized as Black, and what that means in its nuances. So if you are thinking about somebody who's from a Black African background, what country in Africa specifically are we talking about? Are we talking about Ghana? Are we talking about Nigeria? Are we thinking about what that means in terms of impact on language, impact on experiences that they've had in their household, and also knowing how much time we spend speaking to the families of those children as well as the children themselves? Now, of course, in toddlers, in preschool, that perhaps can be done more readily or easier if we're thinking about communication styles as verbal and language and developing that. But it's also not to forget as well children with special educational needs and disabilities, and thinking about as well what it means to communicate with children and not just prioritizing verbal communication. What things are you finding out about that child's home life? pertaining to race, culture, ethnicity, and how are you engaging with the families? So I always thought, perhaps in terms of worldview, educators first. How are you unpacking some of the bias that you hold? Because we all have bias. And also, what does it mean to not transfer those biases onto and into the minds of children, irrespective of your own understanding or lack of understanding? I always ask for there to be a process of unlearning. What do you think you know? How are you going to unlearn that and be re-educated by the children who are in your care and by the families that you're engaging with every day?
I still remember sort of that, what you call a racial reawakening, which is a nice phrase, in 2020. I remember doing after the murder of George Floyd, doing an assembly. It was online because obviously we were in lockdown with the rest of the senior leadership team. I should say as well that Liz trained our children's hub team in Feltham, and they are just so glowing. We're so grateful to have the opportunity to do that. And I suppose that links to this sort of assembly, because in that assembly I remember saying to our sort of 600 children across our primary, look, I'm going to be a bit honest here. I don't really know. I feel like I've got a lot to learn here. I don't really know what to say. I feel like I don't understand this well enough. And so like right now I'm feeling like I need to understand this better. And my sense was that that's sort of where the profession was, like in education more generally. But here's a question for you, Liz. That, in my sense, is what people were like in schools. Like everybody I spoke to, that's what people were like. I don't understand this well enough. I need to understand this better. We need to like know better and do better. But around that, there was kind of like a culture war being stoked around all of this, which for me didn't really connect the reality of the conversations that were happening in school. But if you turn on the news that or social media, that's the conversation you saw. So can I ask, how was it to be the kind of, in many ways, you were the kind of the face of kind of like anti-racist practice in earlier settings and in sort of educations more generally, with that sort of going around you? How did you ignore all of that? How was it to operate?
Well, you know, John, you want to ignore things and then you get put into the center of this strange culture war that's happening, and then the Spectator and the Telegraph contact you, and then they tell you that they're writing a piece about you, and you become a focus for Tory MPs, being charged with being too woke. And this narrative that was being spun around the work that was being done, and actually the reality of that work, and the need, the willingness, the wanting of educators to do this. That backdrop didn't surprise me because, of course, I'm aware I've been living in a Black body for the past 42 years. This wasn't new to me. Navigating that wasn't new to me. It was also really interesting that I told myself, I have to just continue to block out that noise, because the work is important for the children who are at the center of this, for those children who are in very perhaps rural white spaces in the UK, and they are the only Black or brown child in their class. For those children who are in very multicultural, multiracial, multilingual spaces in the UK, but have an all-white teaching team or staff, it's important for those children. And actually enabling teachers, educators to be racially literate was key. That was the thing that was driving me. That was what was essential. The culture wars are always going to happen. The political landscape that we are a part of is always going to do what it does. It was really important for me to not be distracted by that, and to really kind of keep my blinkers on, if you like, and just look straight ahead, and also focus on what it is that the children need and what it is that educators are telling me that they want. They want to become more confident. And this is Black, white, brown educators alike. They want to become more racially literate, because it isn't, and it wouldn't have just been you, John, as you said. It would have been other people that are working alongside you. And it's also not to suppose that just because you have a Black teacher, just because there is a brown teacher, that they are racially literate, or that they want to have that conversation, or that they should be the people that are doing the anti-racist work. I always say that this has to be collective and it has to be collaborative. The onus isn't on the Black staff. it is for everybody to come together, but there has to be some way of allaying the fear. Because I think the fear, I always say this, of saying the wrong thing stops educators from doing anything at all. That's not where we want to be, certainly not in 2024, and certainly not here in the UK, which prides itself on being, you know, a progressive society, a tolerant, as much as I hate that word, a tolerant society, an inclusive education system. And we know that that is not always reflected, but we want to make sure that people feel confident and competent enough to have the conversations that need to happen in the staff room and in the classroom, and also very, very much in teachers and educators' personal lives. Having the conversations, it's important. And I think ensuring that teacher training, educator training, early years educators particularly, that the training is there for them to access.
It's an aspect of your work, Liz, just picking up on a strand that's coming out of that, is you talk a lot about the need to actually have the difficult conversations about anti-racism, and how sometimes that can almost get obfuscated by being kind of lumped in with a broader diversity, equality, inclusion conversation, rather than having the kind of granular focus on those difficult conversations. I will fudge this if I try and explain it. So I'm going to ask you to explain exactly what you mean by that.
So we're thinking about DEI, okay, diversity, equity, and inclusion, okay, and belonging. Sometimes that B is there at the end. And that is very important. It's all fair and well. But often what happens is, because people generally are uncomfortable about talking about race, because there is a racial illiteracy, as I call it, that often gets left off the table when we're talking about diversity, inclusion, equity, belonging. And what is on the table are things that shouldn't be off, but they can be intersected with. We can also speak about disability and racism. We can talk about what it means to think about our trans children and trans communities and racism. We can think about what it means to have 2 or 3 or 4 identity markers at the same time. We are people who are a multitude of things, all of us here. We are not just our racialized identity. However, the impact of racism in our society means that some children are going to be impacted more than others if they are racialized as Black. If they are thinking about moving and navigating through a society which is going to judge them based on their racialized identity, then we have to have a granular focus on what it means to be anti-racist, looking not just at interactions and interpersonal things that happen in our early year spaces, in our education spaces, but thinking widely about the structures and the systems that enable that interpersonal thing to happen. So it's more than the name calling. It's thinking about those structures and those systems that normalize us to perhaps not have the conversation, or to have the conversation which just excuses race. So when we start talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and we don't have a focus on anti-racist practice, in my opinion, that becomes null and void, because we are talking about everything except the thing that's too difficult. And we have to think about why that has become, or that precedent has been set, particularly in a UK context. And I say that because I think when we are having conversations about anti-racism, and we're thinking about the ways in which conversations are often imported from a North American lens, things become confusing. Our context here in Britain is different. And it's not to devalue anything that is coming from, you know, a global perspective. But we must consider that actually the UK has a role to play in ensuring that we speak about race and racism. Whilst there are culture wars happening and there are things that are being focused on in terms of, you know, we don't need to talk about race, or we do need to talk about race, but we need to be softer. We need to be nicer when we're speaking about it. We don't want to make white people feel uncomfortable. Part of this is being uncomfortable, all of us being uncomfortable and sitting in that discomfort until we work out how to get out of it. And thinking around, as I said, the confusion and conflation of, you know, DEI work and anti-racism. They can sit together, but there also needs to be space to pull it apart so that we are specific about what we mean when we are thinking about racism in our spaces in the early years, racism's in our playgrounds in primary school, racism amongst and within staff teams, senior leadership, and structurally and systemically how racism is being able to stay present all of the time. So as I said, I think there is room and space for all these conversations to be had all of the time. I very much advocate for racism to be put under a safeguarding umbrella, knowing as well that when we are thinking about training as educators, when we are training as educators, safeguarding is always prioritized. When we think about the impact of racial trauma, that also is a safeguarding issue. We know children who experience racism, that goes on and carries on impacting way into adulthood. And not only does my work tell me that, but, you know, lived experience tells me that, but we have to be able to grapple with that, that reality of the impact of racism.
So, you know, your 4E's framework, is that the starting point for the conversations in settings about those?
I always say that: embrace, embed, ensure, and extend. And I devised that 4E's of anti-racist practice as a starting point, as you said, Emma. So actually educators can just quickly glance and think, okay, what does it mean to embrace, okay, children who are in my setting, particularly if they are different from me in terms of their racialized identity, in terms of their culture? What does it mean to embed a sense of belonging? What does that look like? When we talk about safe spaces, safe for who? What does safety look like? What does that mean? Ensuring, you know, that you have this culture of belonging, that you are embedding this sense of practice, but you're checking in all of the time. What knowledge do I have? What knowledge do the people in my space have? And what knowledge do the children have? We talk about funds of knowledge. We talk about this, you know, invisible knapsack or backpack concept. What are the children coming? What can the children show me and tell me about who they are? And then extending those learning opportunities, not just by using, you know, black dolls, but actually thinking, what is a suitable resource to help me expand this idea that I have? You know, there is no point just having lots of books with black characters if all of the black characters are the baddies. It means that you have to think critically about your resources. And I put that lastly in that 4E's with intention, because I don't want us to get carried away with resources first if we haven't done that work around ourselves as educators. The resources is the last thing that you should be looking at. If we don't know how to effectively use those resources, there's no point having them. And so I want us to think very carefully and also very critically about the work that we've been doing, the work that all of us have been engaging with, and how we have moved forward or in the right direction to ensure that we're prioritizing and thinking about those 4E's all of the time.
I guess there's no point changing the contents of the cupboards if your contents of your mind doesn't change.
Absolutely that, yeah, totally that. And it's something that we always think about in, you know, the work that we do as educators. We have to think about what has driven us to become people that want to work in this space. Why do we want to work with children and families? What is it? And when we start unpacking that, we will be able to answer those questions for ourselves. But we'll look at the colleagues, we'll look at the different spaces in education that are created to foster this, you know, sense of belonging. We start critically analysing the safe spaces. We start looking at gender imbalance. We start looking at the inequity around maternal health rates. We start questioning and looking at those things, and that's good. Yes, it might be uncomfortable, but it's really good to start having, as I said, the conversation and start to unpack it in the spaces within our schools and within our nurseries.
What are you thinking, John?
So much.
Is that a good thing, John?
You've got your thinking face on there.
I know. So so if it's okay, let's just stick this out. Also, yeah, there's so much that I want to like download your brain on. But let's just stick with not changing people's minds, but helping people to unlearn and learn and kind of get a more sophisticated understanding of this. I suppose that sometimes what you do see is like some barriers going up, and you mentioned it a little bit, partially because of the national conversation and people thinking, like you have a conversation with a grandparent or something, and they say a coloured person, and you say, oh, you can't say coloured person anymore. And they say, well, what should I say then? You say person of colour. And they go, oh, for goodness sake, like you just changed two of the words around and now I'm a racist all of a sudden. And feel like they're being sort of like tripped up or sort of like tricked. And I suppose that there maybe are like some of those misconceptions and myths around sort of like what this work is. So I'd love you having the benefit of obviously worked with thousands of people and probably seen like what are the common kind of like misconceptions, like hang-ups, myths that people come to when they come to do this work.
So always defensiveness, not wanting to be told that what somebody has prided themselves on doing so well, this thing around educator ego, right? We're all going to get it wrong. First of all, accepting we're all going to get it wrong, and we all need to be able to be in a position to be corrected. That's first of all what I come up against, defensiveness. Often when we're thinking about racial literacy, that would be defined as like white fragility. That is a term that had come up around thinking about what it means to be a person who's racialized as white and being told, oh no, you're wrong, and then being met with tears, defensiveness, and how dare you. This notion of this binary of good and bad, if you're racist, you're bad. If you're not racist, you're good. And flattening that out in this kind of simplistic way and getting people to understand it is not about whether you're a good or bad person. We live in a racist society. We live in a sexist society. We live in a transphobic and homophobic society. We live in an Islamophobic society. We live in an anti-Semitic society. Accepting this is the society that we are a part of and we have had a part in playing and creating. So when you start breaking down that it's nothing to do with that you are a good person or a bad person, we all play our part in upholding this within society. But when we start to unpack particularly like anti-Blackness as the root, as the foundation for racism, then people start to understand, okay, this is more than just using the N-word, using the P-word, and referring to somebody as coloured instead of a person of colour. Then thinking, well, some people are like, I don't want to be called a person of colour. I want to be defined by my racialized identity, which in my case is Black. I'm a Black woman. I want you to recognise that my pronouns are she and her. I want you to recognise that when I walk into a room, there are different barriers that I have versus you, Emma. And so I think when I start thinking about some of the myths, why do we want to talk to children about this? They're too young. They don't even notice colour. And I myself, as an educator, I don't see colour. Colour doesn't matter to me. Not realising that is probably one of the most harmful things that you can say. Because the minute you start saying as an educator, I don't see colour, all of the children are the same, you are dismissing those barriers, those very real barriers that children face and families face because of their racialized identities, because we live in a racist society. And when I think about what people imagine is happening with 3- and 4-year-olds, this thing around, well, are you sitting all the children down and telling the white children they are bad and telling the Black children they're victims? No. What we're doing is introducing them to the concept of belonging, and the concept of these same things we are saying to children who are in the toddler room or preschool. Everybody is your friend. We all here have an equal stake in making sure that perhaps our preschool room is a place that everybody feels that they are invited into. Everybody feels that they can thrive. Everybody should speak to each other with respect. Everybody should comfort another person if they are upset. Those same values we really instill in preschool and in our toddler room. They are not dissimilar to the same values that we're thinking about. If we're looking at anti-racist practice, we would add, it doesn't matter actually what skin colour your friends are. This is the added on bit. We are still going to treat them with respect, but we're going to mention skin colour because it's important for children at that age to start recognising, oh, my friend gets treated a little bit differently to that friend because of their skin colour. We are going to say, we notice that you can see your coat's red and your other friend's coat is blue. Why would we assume that children don't recognise that their skin is different to their friend's skin colour, or there are other people in the world that don't have the same skin colour? At an age appropriate and stage appropriate time, we're also going to talk about how that is sometimes a barrier to people being made to feel as though they belong. Children understand very complex ideas about belonging. We know that. We talk to children about safeguarding themselves when it comes to, the NSPCC had a campaign about what's in your pants stays in your pants. We're talking to children about sexual abuse. That's a big, complex concept, but we're introducing it to children at 3 years old. We're talking about the need for them to have bodily autonomy. They, I think, are big concepts. Why would we then shy away from talking to children about race and racism? So we have to start planting those seeds early on, but equipping our educators to hold space, if you like, for those conversations. So I think myth busting in terms of what's actually taking place and how we're using perhaps books as a way to support the ways that we talk about this, or resources. We wouldn't like to think people would say it's bad to have dolls that have got different colors. We would like to think that all parents who bring their children into a space where they're going to be educated have no problem with that. But we've also got to understand the evolution. Perhaps I'm using dolls as an example, that yes, we would like to have dolls of different, ethnicities, different racialized identities, but that doesn't mean that we should also have gollywogs, But we live in a time and a space where gollywogs are still sold, gollywogs are still displayed in shop windows in different parts of the UK, because the UK is bigger than Birmingham, it's bigger than Manchester, London, Bristol. There are lots of places that still do celebrate or acknowledge that there is nothing wrong with gollywogs. It's fine to have gollywogs. And we also have to grapple with those attitudes as well. It's not to say we shouldn't have the conversation, though, because I challenge those conversations in the sessions that I do as well. People are in my sessions whose parents had gollywogs. They themselves may have had gollywog dolls, but don't understand the historical context, perhaps, of what that means and what it was born out of. So I think opening up this conversation to make it transparent helps to myth bust. And it's also, as I said, about you as an educator, particularly the early years, knowing your children and knowing your families so that you can have these conversations. Nothing is happening, behind closed doors that we don't want to share with the families. Sharing is absolutely essential in this work because, as I said, it has to be collective and it has to be collaborative and it has to involve the parents and the families too.
Liz, I just want to pick up on something else that you talk about that kind of links to that as well, because this is serious work. There's a serious, challenging conversations, but that doesn't mean that the setting can't be absolutely full of joy at the same time. And I really wanted you to talk as well about this idea of joy in the early years space within an anti-racist approach.
Yeah, totally. Because of this binary that we deal with about like good and bad, and racism, we know is bad, but are you racist? Are you anti-racist? Are you not racist? All of these things. The flattening of it, as I said earlier, makes people feel as though, well, this is so heavy. How can there be possibly any space for joy in this? This must be really depressing to be talking about this state of the world and how bad things are. Yes, things are bad, but children, by and large, we want them as educators to exist in a space of joy, and it is our job to maintain that joyful space for them as much of the time as possible. And I think even when we are thinking about topics like, quote unquote, behavior management, how do we manage how children are engaging and interacting? How are we showing children about the boundaries of their behaviors and their personalities forming? What do we say to children who are 3, who want to rock on the chair and they may fall off? We as adults, we perceive the danger of them continuing to rock on a chair. Do we shout? No. Do we raise our voice? No. Do we get down on their level? Yes. Do we talk to them about risk assessment? Yes, we do. And do we talk to them about, well, I don't really want to go to hospital today, and I don't think you want to go to hospital. I think it will really hurt if you fall off that chair. So maybe we should keep the 4 legs of the chair on the floor. Could we do that? Could we all do that together? We think about intonation, don't we? We think about making sure it is a safe space for children to understand about boundaries, and also how we continue to challenge those things, because we know it's not textbook. The child's not always going to be like, yeah, I'm going to do that. That's absolutely fine. The child's going to push back, and we welcome the pushback. That child's going to say, no, I want to continue to rock on the chair. And we say, okay, let's think about what's going to happen if you continue to do that. And so we're always thinking about different ways in which we can bring joy into the space, because I think when we're thinking about anti-racist practices, we're thinking about racism, we also need to have a notion of celebration. And that isn't, celebrating Black History Month because it's October. Yes, that's important, but we should be celebrating joy throughout the year. I always think about how educators use tone, how they use body language, and also how they use their facial expressions, particularly with children who are under 2, so babies particularly. And when we're thinking about spreading that joy, we know there's a lot of focus on how children respond to our face, babies, how they respond to them being picked up, you know, and what does it mean to bring that into a space when children are a little bit more or a little older. So the concept for me of joy, Emma, is about remaining faithful to that core principle of fun. Whenever we turn on children's television, whenever we go into children's play spaces, you know, we think about joy. We think about people like Floella Benjamin, and we think joy, happiness. We think there's a lot of light in the work that she does. And I focus on Floella Benjamin for some of the work that I did because I know it was significant for my own childhood. And I think, what does it mean actually to be a Black woman on children's television at a time where there was absolute, you know, pushback to her being on television as a Black woman? Floella Benjamin didn't come onto television and speak about that primarily, but in her presence, in her joyfulness, it made us think, oh, wow, this is brilliant. Like, oh, Floella Benjamin. Thinking about Lizzie from Playdays. I'm doing a real throwback now. Let's just go back to But, you know, I remember Lizzie, this puppet on Playdays, and she was just so joyful. Yes, of course, she was operated by strings, but there was something about Playdays, the notion of Lizzie and her being very joyful, which really made us think, oh, this is quite powerful, isn't it? And then as we did the deeper thinking, as we got older and as we became educators, we thought, wow, that was quite significant for other reasons. Because actually, we've now started to think about what it meant to be in that space and be racialized as Black, what it means to be watching CBeebies now, what it means to be engaging with joyful elements of childhood, and how do we transpose that onto our day-to-day practice. We can keep it light, we can, and we can keep it joyful, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't grapple with those hard things. Back to that NSPCC campaign of what's in your pants stays in your pants. A crocodile was the character that was used to think about pants that were spotty. Some pants were stripy. We're thinking about knickers. You know, we're thinking about pants, but these things were still brought to us in a space and in a way that exuded joy. So joy has to be at the center of this. This is early childhood, you know, and that has to be a remaining principle if we're going to do this work effectively.
I love that framing of it because it's so asset based, and I think that you're right that sometimes people do, Emma, that you're right, people come into this thinking it's more like, oh, what can we, you know, we're going to tell people they're doing things wrong, or we're going to have very serious conversations all of the time, or we're going to talk about how bleak the world is and how like structural racism is, and like it's the opposite. It's that actually these children come with the, you know, the knapsack. They come with this rich kind of like, you know, belonging is being valued and known for all of you, and it's enriching for the whole setting. It's enriching for everybody else for all of that to be brought into the space, not tolerated, certainly not sort of kept out, but brought into the space. I love that framing of it. Can I ask one last big question? We're almost out of time, so it's time to crack open the big political fire. As I said, it's 2024 now, not 2020 anymore, and I'd be interested in sort of how you see things have changed. But you are an expert on race, and there is, for many people, there's an issue with especially sort of white working class boys at the moment, and we've seen scenes over the last sort of 12 months of kind of a group of people who are not making good choices for themselves, for society, who seem to be a particular risk of kind of radicalization, particular risk of sort of influencers. So like, how do you think that has played out? Is there, you said, you know, this isn't like taking things off the table. Is a better understanding of race and anti-racism going to help with that, with
1000%. I think there's something to be said again around how do we intersect and look at and talk about class? Okay, how are we defining working class? What does it mean? And when we have these conversations pertaining to white working class boys, we should be talking about class, of course, that's important. And we should talk about those racializing elements of how these things impact different groups of people. So if we're talking about white working class boys, we're talking about the working class by and large. We're talking about the bigger political landscape of what has been done to disenfranchise, okay, these people. Why do people feel like they are not a part of this belonging? And what does that mean in a society which is perpetuated and absolutely intentionally divided people, so that there are class divides, there are race divides, there are things where people don't feel as though they are a part of something? And why has that enabled people to turn against one another, particularly in this conversation, thinking about, you know, white working class being brought into the table, on the table, when we're saying we need to think about racism. The whataboutery comes in. What about white working class boys? Nobody's saying we shouldn't be talking about that. We should be talking about class and race and gender. And we should be talking about this poverty gap for all. We should be thinking about what that means if people are becoming influenced by different people in different spaces. We should be talking about sexism and misogyny. We should be talking about how young boys are radicalized at a very early age, not just white boys or black boys or boys who are South Asian or mixed heritage or East or Southeast Asian. Let's talk about misogyny. Let's talk about gendered play. Let's talk about the fact that in an early year space, we would look in horror if we heard a little boy say to a little girl, no, you can't play with the cars. Cars are for boys. You should be playing with the dolls. You should be playing with the home corner. We would instantly, no. Everybody can play with everything. But how often do we look deeper into that and say, well, these are the beginning seeds, the plants of misogyny? If we were just to allow that to happen and allow that to fester, and also allow other things to take hold in the lives of these children, this is where we get into this place of absolute division without any conversation. And so I think there is a space to have conversation about race. There is absolutely a conversation to be had about class. Since the early years, particularly, and kind of policymakers always look at this divide, this poverty, this gap that needs to be closed, yet they don't want to talk about those wider issues which cause the gap to be there in the first place, i.e. the ruling class, if you like. If we're going to talk about class, let's talk about this properly. Who is it that is making these decisions about who gets and who does not get? Why is there a poverty gap in the first place? And what does it mean, as I said, to feel like you're not a part of a conversation? Well, it means that people start creating their own narratives and they start to fight and push against a system which has forever marginalized them. But it isn't to say that there is no unity that can be gained there. That conversation about being white and working class also needs to be had around and with people who are Bangladeshi and working class, people who are Black and working class, the working class across the spectrum, because actually it means different things to different people, depending on your racialized identities, whether we like it or not. And so I think this is the thing, that the dealing with the truth of the matter is essential, but making sure that there is room for all of these conversations to be had simultaneously, because they can be had. And we often look at the ways in which things divide us and leave it there. After the division, let's talk about the unity. Let's talk about the ways in which we can bring these narratives together. So I think this notion, John, you know, you talked about this giving space and time and value to all children's lived experiences and all of the narratives together. How often are we doing that? How intentionally are we doing that as well? Because I think it's absolutely essential that that happens in all nursery, early years spaces with childminders across the spectrum of spaces that are created for children to thrive, particularly when policy is telling us that all children deserve the best start in life. That all is doing a lot of heavy lifting. We need to really analyze what that all means and what that looks like.
Last one from me, Liz, which kind of links to what John was saying. So I saw an interview with you and you were talking about the impact of Viola Davis's autobiography on your thinking around poverty and what it means for children who arrive at settings.
Yeah.
Or having another impact of poverty. But the last thing that kind of links to that is another quote that I've heard you say about the EYFS needs people who love children. And just your expansion on what that actually means to genuinely love children in the EYFS.
Dr. Jules Page talks about this, professional love, the concept of professional love, and the importance of what it feels like for a child to feel like somebody's excited to see them. Somebody cannot wait for them to come through the door. As a nursery manager, I spent a lot of time opening the door, closing the door, welcoming people in the morning, closing the door when they left. And every single child that came through that door, I was so excited to see them. I was so excited to talk to them about what they had done, what they had hoped to do for the day, and also me telling them how happy I was to see them at nursery. That was my job, actually, to demonstrate professional love and to be excited about every person that stepped through my door. The notion of what that means to live in poverty, the notion of poverty and the notion of us not being able to grapple with it if we've not experienced it, is something we also need to challenge ourselves to do as educators, because there's nothing wrong with acknowledging you haven't had that experience, okay? There's nothing wrong with acknowledging your privilege, but it's also important, those educators who have lived experience of poverty, to be involved in the conversation, because nothing beats lived experience. And also to acknowledge that if a child has come in hungry, it is your job to make sure that you feed them in an early year space and in an education space generally, but to ask that question, and to ask that question with respect. And that looks different depending on the age of the children. So if the children at my nursery came in after 9 o'clock, and after 9 o'clock, it wasn't breakfast time anymore, it was still my job as a nursery manager to ensure that child had breakfast or that child had something to eat, without saying, oh, are you starving? Are you hungry? Have you not eaten anything today? Just saying, oh, I could do with a bit of toast. Do you want some toast as well? Would you like some Weetabix? There's a way in which you phrase these questions which doesn't highlight the shame that is often attached and associated with this word, poverty. And in the nursery space, that is one example of what we might do. But also to give space for the voices in the room to speak about lived experience. Nothing should make people feel as though they can't be a part of that conversation, because I think there is still, it's a loaded term. There is still a lot of that shame attached with that word, poverty. And I think if we don't recognize the structural things around who is most likely to be existing in that space of poverty, who's most likely to be wanting to be in a space of equity, who is the most marginalized. If we don't recognize that, if we're not aware of that, then we're not going to be doing our jobs properly. We're not going to be fulfilling our roles of being able to deliver professional love, to make children feel as though they belong.
I wish we had another hour, Liz. But I told you we feel like we're just getting going, and then
Yeah, that's the introduction done. Right, let's get
Oh, thank you so much. And I think that idea of professional love and respect for the children who walk through your door, I love that idea that it's your job to make those children feel like they are so important when they walk through the door. And that idea of the first one to greet and the last one to wave goodbye at the end of the day, such a powerful image to frame everything that you've said today. I'm absolutely delighted that you've come on and spoken about all these things. So many provocations for thought, for future work, for reflection. I don't even know how to start summing that one up, to be perfectly honest. I have made more.
It's a wonderful moment in time, isn't it? It's great to kind of have this conversation, because I know that you over the last 4 years have been at the vanguard of supporting schools, educators, early years settings to think more deeply about anti-racism, but about their children, about the children that they have in front of them as people, as in all their fullness. And so it was so great to kind of take stock again with you in 2024. If people want to find out more about you, where do they find you? How do they get in touch?
Where do they find me? Everywhere and anywhere, because I'm very nosy. And I like to be in everybody's business. I like to be at every table. No, so on Instagram, the Black Nursery Manager. On X, Liz Pem, TBNM. On LinkedIn, Liz Pemberton. But really, I think I would encourage people to talk to others who have engaged with some of the work that I've done, who have engaged with training that I've delivered, who have engaged with consultancy services that I've offered. Nothing beats word of mouth and reflection. Nothing beats somebody telling somebody else who works at another nursery or another school, oh yeah, we had this conversation with Liz, or Liz came into the space and she talked about. I think it's always important to speak to others who have experienced me, if you like. Yeah, you can find out information about me online, but nothing's going to be, as I said, you speaking to somebody about their experience and also what that learning journeys looks like for them. Because often the things that I speak about or the provocations that I deliver, things don't take set until sometimes years after. Because I understand and recognize these are big, massive things I'm talking about, and pennies drop at different times. And that's not to insult anybody, it's to say it's a lot of information to process. I'm trying to package things into an hour or 90 minutes or 4 days or a week. So yeah, they are the places: Instagram, LinkedIn, and X.
And your website, Liz.
On my website, yeah, you can pop on there if you'd like to see some smiley pictures of me. You know, get in touch with ways in which I could perhaps come into your space and speak to you and really hold your hand through this. I am more than happy to hold hands through this. It's going to squeeze your hand. Sometimes I'm going to squeeze your hand and I'm going to make you feel uncomfortable, and that's fine. And you might be upset, and that's fine, but we'll get out the other end. You'll be left feeling like, oh, that was a lot of information, but I feel a bit better, I feel a bit lighter eventually. Like that one.
Thank you so much for coming on and starting off what I hope to be lots of people's conversation and thinking around this, and a nudge towards getting in touch with you or re-engaging with their thinking around this. So thank you so much for coming on, Liz. It's been brilliant.
Thank you, Emma.
Brilliant. Thank you.
I'm so glad that I sat in a chair for this, Liz.
You're a serious face. So thank you so much. Thank you to everybody for listening to this episode of Mind the Gap, making education work across the globe. Thanks to my co-host, Jon Hutchinson, and thanks so much to our wonderful guest, Liz Pemberton. Thank you for listening to Mind the Gap. I'm Emma Turner and I've been presenting with my co-host Jon Hutchinson. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave us a review, share on social media and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Find us on our YouTube channel by searching Mind the Gap with Jon and Emma, or head over to Spotify for an audio version. This podcast was produced in association with Haringey Education Partnership, and our producer is Luke Kemper.